Hey crafters, thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to use Lavinia Stamps products to make a card inspired by Chinese lanterns. Hope you enjoy! So I used a lot of watercolor techniques in this card. So I'm using the palette area of my Tim Holtz Media Mat so that you can see the colors. And I just put a few different colors down of the Elements inks and then spritzed them with water. And then I just added a light spritz of water on my piece of paper that will be the background. And then using a fan brush, I applied some of the Elements inks in horizontal stripes. And this gives us a beautiful light background. And then I dried it with my heat tool. And I'm just using regular card for this, or regular paper, so I didn't add too much water. Next, I wanted to stamp the images of Star and Pan. And Pan has a little stick which carries a sack. But I'm just going to do some selective inking here. So I used a bit of a Post-it note to cover up the area where his sack is. And then I will remove this before I push down the stamp. And that way we're not stamping that part of the stamp. So I'm just going to make sure that my paper is lined up here, and then I can remove that Post-it note and push it down. Now, because there is a lot of ink on the background, it helps to use a stamp positioner, and it also makes doing selective inking like this a lot easier. So you can see there's a few areas on Star that aren't very dark, so I'm just going to apply a little bit more ink on both those stamps, and then I can re-stamp them. And I'm just using that Post-it note again and making sure my paper is lined up before pushing it down. And there's a little area near Star's ear that didn't quite stamp properly. So I'm just going to make sure that's nice and I have a nice impression there. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to add some fairy lanterns. And I'm sure there is one from Lavinia Stamps that is an individual fairy lantern. And I thought I had it when I was designing this card, but it turns out that I don't. So I used the stamp that's called Fairy Lantern, which has a whole bunch of them on it. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing with some more Post-it notes and selectively ink some of the fairy lanterns. So I'm using one of the smaller ones to put it at the end of Pan's stick so that it looks like he's carrying one of these lanterns. And it's the same direction as Star's lantern. Then I'm going to move this image down and I'm going to add some more in the sky. And I want them to look like Chinese lanterns that are floating up. So I need to put them at various heights and have them going with the pointed side up. So when I first put this on, I realized it was upside down. So I just turned it around so that it's the pointed side facing up. And to make this background a little bit more exciting, I'll put them at varying heights. And each time I'm just using some Post-it notes to do my selective stamping. And then I'm removing the Post-it notes before I'm pushing this down. And I'm using the full stick Post-it notes, so they work really well for this. But you could also use regular Post-it notes or even masking paper. So I'm going to continue adding about 6 of these fairy lanterns. I'm using some of the larger one and some of the middle-sized one so that it makes it a little bit more interesting. And I won't show all of this because it's quite repetitive, but you can see how easy it is to do, especially if you have a stamp positioner like this. So now that I've got all 6 done, I'm going to add a little bit more ink on the background. So I started off with 2 colors here, and again I spritzed them with water. And then using a fan brush, I'm going to paint in Star's skirt. And I want the attention to be on those Chinese lanterns. So I'm purposely using darker colors on her hat and her skirt and the wings, just so that those bright lanterns will really catch the attention of the person looking at this. So for both Pan and Star, I used the violet chalk on their wings, and then I'm going to add a little bit of Blue Lagoon as well. And I'll paint this on top of that violet chalk, as well as over Star's hair here. And also using these colors helps to make Star less of a Christmas fairy and helps her work in other scenes as well. Now before I ink up those lanterns, I'm going to make sure this is completely dry and use one of the Lavinia Stamps stencils. This one is called Pods, and it's a similar shape to those Chinese lanterns, so I think it works perfectly. And I'm just going to use some light ink through the stencil. So I've got a bit of pine here. And I'm not worried too much about doing the entire area. I'm just putting the ink mostly towards the bottom and the middle. You can always add more later on, as you see I do later on in the video. And then I'm going to add a little bit of that violet chalk. And also a little bit of that Blue Lagoon as well. And it doesn't matter if these pods overlap, they don't have to line up. We're just adding a bit of texture in the background. And then on the very bottom of the scene, I'm going to use that lovely purple violet chalk and just put some underneath both their feet. And I'm using the hillside mask for this. And then I'm going to add some of that Blue Lagoon around the top area of our scene. And I'm trying to go around those lanterns because I want to have them as white as possible, which will make it easier to color them in. But it doesn't matter if you do accidentally put a little bit of ink on top of them. Now I wanted the lanterns to be a yellow color, but I don't have any of the Lavinia inks that are a bright yellow. So what I did is I used that russet orange, which is on the right hand side of my palette, but I lightened it a little bit. So there is one of the Dinkle colors that is a white. It's called Porcelain, and it works really well for brightening up any of the colors. So I'm just going to add that into my russet orange and then mix them together. And you can add as much of this as you want, and you'll get this beautiful yellow. And I'm just going to paint this over a couple of the pods and then blot off the extra paint with a paper towel. That way we can still see those black lines. And I'll continue to do this on all of those pods, including the one that Star is holding and the one that Pan is holding as well. And I didn't worry too much about the outside lines because I'm going to fix those later on. And already you can see how nice and bright those yellow fairy pods are. So I'll make sure that this is nice and bright. I'm just mixing in a bit of water and splattering some on the sky. Now you can make your sky this color if you like, or even darker as I do later on. So So make sure this is completely dry and use my heat tool on it. And then I can fix those fairy pods. So I decided that the sky was a bit dark for me at this point. So I added a bit more of that porcelain dinkles and just painted it across the top and the left and right side. Now later on, I do end up changing this, but I wanted to leave it in the video just so that you can see that it's all right to change your mind as you are working on a card. Especially if you're using products like these that will easily work on top of each other, as you'll see. So I just blended this down a bit more and it gave me a lighter blue sky. And then adding some details, I just used a black detailed pen and outlined each of the fairy pods. And I drew in those lines, and in the second and the fourth section of each of these fairy pods, I just drew in some circles, roughly copying the design that was already on the stamp. And I didn't worry too much about the other sections because I liked the look of just coloring in 2 sections. And then I repeated this on all the fairy pods, or the lanterns as they are now. Now this did take a little bit of time, so I'm going to do the rest of this off camera. But as you can see, it makes a huge difference and brings those lanterns to life. Now I'm going to add a little bit of sparkle. So I've got a sparkle pen here, which I'm going to put on the fairy's wings. And then also on top of each of those fairy pods. And this helps to further brighten up that yellow, which started off as the russet orange ink. Now, before I continue with the rest of this design, I'm going to put this whole thing onto my card base so that I can move on to the next step. So I've got a 5x7" card base. And because I used watercolor techniques, I'm going to use double-sided tape as well as a little bit of glue to make sure this is firmly secured onto the back of my card base. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not quite happy with the sky yet, but I will come back to it. First, however, I'm going to put some glossy accents on all of those fairy lanterns. And this does take a little bit of time to dry. So I ended up leaving it overnight, but a good hour or 2 would be enough to make sure this is as solid and it has set. And one of the great things about this is it gives the fairy lanterns a nice realistic 3D texture, but it also helps to make a natural mask. So I'm going to apply a little bit more ink on the top of the background and also through the stencil. And that glossy accents will resist this ink. So just use a little bit of violet chalk, and I just wanted to put a bit more towards the top of the card, because I had forgotten to put some at the top here. And then using that same violet chalk ink, I'm going to put some along the top edge. And I love how the violet chalk and the blue lagoon work so well together. And they give you this very rich, dark blue-purple sky. And I think that helps to make the lantern stand out even more when you have a dark sky as your background. Now, if you happen to get any of that ink over the glossy accents, you can easily wipe it off with a paper towel. So I'm just going to add that Blue Lagoon on top, and I have that beautiful sky. And now I've kind of covered up that splatter that I had on before. So I'm going to take out a little bit more of that porcelain colored dinkles, mix it with that russet orange, and add a little bit of water. And when I first add it together, it's not quite the yellow that I had in mind. So as I mix it together here, you'll see it's a little bit more orangey rather than yellow. So I'm just going to add even more of that Dinkles powder. And now it's a nice bright yellow. So I'll use that and splatter it on the top of the card. And I'm just using a fan brush for that, so I get a beautiful splatter. And I didn't want any to go on those two images, so I protected them with an acrylic block. And then if you happen to get any on that glossy accents, it's easily fixed. So just use a little corner of paper towel and you can wipe off those areas. And you have this beautiful card. And I think I'll add the sentiment to this one later on. And I'll make sure this is completely heat set. Just gorgeous. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this video inspiring. If you haven't already, please subscribe so that you're notified whenever I post a new video. Have a crafty day!